iHeartRadio presents Podversations, a weekly discussion with the biggest names and influencers in podcasting.
Hello and welcome back to the iHeartPodcast speaker series. I'm Will Pearson, president of iHeartPodcasts. As you know, we like to get together each week and talk about a different podcast or family of podcasts. Today is going to be a super interesting one. We are going to be talking about the show Betrayal, which became a huge hit for us, and it's in the true crime space. And it's maybe worth stopping down for just a second and talking about why we do true crime or how we think about true crime here at iHeart. When we do shows in this space, maybe going back to some of our earliest shows in the true crime space, and you think about shows like Atlanta Monster, or you think about shows like Happy Face, we often think before we greenlight a show, why are we doing this show? And what we never want to do is produce true crime just for the sake of talking about crime. Whenever we think about a show that we want to greenlight, we think about it through a lens of, what is important to tell about this story. In the case of Atlanta Monster, with the tragic disappearances of predominantly young boys, young Black boys in the city of Atlanta a couple of decades ago, we were trying to tell this larger social story, this story of relationship with police departments, with the relationship of communities. As we tell a story like Happy Face, the story of Melissa Moore, the daughter of the Happy Face serial killer, we want to tell the stories of those that are victims in different ways. And today we're talking about the show Betrayal. We're going to be talking to Andrea Gunning, who was the host of the first season. And we're talking with Ashley Lytton, who was actually our season 2 Betrayal survivor, to talk about each of their seasons. But Andrea, Ashley, thanks for spending some time with us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm going to go back to season 1, which featured, this story of betrayal about a woman named Jennifer, her now ex-husband Spencer. And Andrea, I'll toss to you first and get a sense. What was it that drew you to this story, and maybe just share a little bit about the story of what we were trying to do with this first season?
Yeah, so I had first gotten a call from Jen's agent because she works in the reality TV space, and that's Glass Entertainment Group's bread and butter. And I had worked with Jared a lot. He's a great guy. And he set up a call, and when we spoke to Jennifer for the first time, what was apparent to me was her pain was so palpable. Like, she had just lost her entire foundation of what she thought her life actually was. And I had gone through like similar infidelity, and I kind of understood, not to the gravity that she experienced, but there was something like I could feel her pain within myself. It was identifiable. It was relatable. And I just wanted to help her understand and make sense of what happened to her, and have her try to figure out who the man she married actually was. And I think it just felt so relatable to me, and I couldn't ignore her pain. And that's really why I gravitated to the story.
For anyone watching or listening today that has not had a chance to check out season 1, and there probably aren't that many of them, because again, this podcast hit number 1. It's now surged twice, which is, again, as we try to tell stories like this, it really is nice to see audiences catching on and wanting to share these stories. But for those that haven't listened, can you share a little bit about what that was, what the betrayal was?
Yeah,
what we're digging into with the story?
Absolutely. So Jen was confronted with the fact that her husband was being arrested for sexually assaulting a student. He was a 3-time teacher of the year in Georgia. He was a big person in their community. It's the love of her life. If they were college sweethearts, they broke up for a while, then kind of found each other later in life. And, through him being arrested, that happened. And then she was like, what's going on? I need to kind of investigate more, and soon found evidence of like affair after affair, people she knew, random women, all over the map. And so it became this, he basically was unfaithful to her almost every day of their marriage, and they were married for 7 years. And so The podcast is really her understanding and speaking with the sexual assault victim, the other women that he had affairs with, and then also to experts to really get to understand who her husband actually is and figure out what a perpetrator is and what their behavior is like. And, he groomed a lot of his victims. And so we talk and explore grooming. So that's essentially what we did with season 1.
Yeah. And the season, like we said, really took off, and in a lot of ways, this first story of betrayal became bigger than I think many of us thought it would. Any thoughts from you on as this got out into the world and started to build this audience and again surged to the top of the charts? I mean, what were your thoughts on all of this?
Jen and I were like, we're gonna upload to Omni and then get out of the country is kind of what was our plan, because we just didn't know how it would do. You never know in podcasting, you just don't know. And so after, like, I think a week in, I had went away with my mom, and she called me and she was just crying, and we just couldn't believe it. We just couldn't believe it was performing so well and people were really resonating with it. But I think if it goes back to my initial phone call with her, there's just something relatable about her pain, unfortunately. I think different people, especially women, can see themselves in Jen. And I know, Ashley, that's certainly how you felt. And I think that there's something to be said about exploring difficult conversations. I mean, Jen had to sit down with the high school student that he really damaged and hurt. And she gave and provided that space to Jen. And Jen had conversations with the women he had affairs with, and they carried a lot of shame. And she kind of relieved them of that, that shame and that pain. And so there was something really powerful there. And so it's complicated. Life isn't black and white, it's gray. And I think people appreciate when we focus on that gray.
Yeah. Well, you talk about a lot of big ideas, which sometimes do sit in that gray space. Concepts like betrayal, trauma. And it's something that we often don't talk a whole lot about. Do you mind talking about that? And then would love to hear from Ashley a bit as well.
Yeah, for Jen, when something like this happens where makes you fundamentally look at your life, like where you are now in your past, you're kind of confronted of like what was real, what wasn't real. And so that makes you feel extremely unsafe. I had never heard of the topic, or I never heard of betrayal trauma. And so until I worked on this show, and I thought it was such an important thing to talk about because it made a lot of sense. Of course, Jen is afraid. Of course, Jen is scared. Of course, she's going to have trust issues. So let's explore that. Right. Because it's a lot of collateral damage. I mean, Ashley, you know that better than I do.
Yeah. Ashley, I would love to hear your just what made you decide to reach out, because you were one of the millions of listeners for the first season of Betrayal. And you were compelled to then reach out to Andrea and sort of share your story and talk about this, which ultimately ended up becoming the subject matter of season 2. What made you decide to reach out?
Yeah, so I think going back to the whole betrayal trauma, part of Jen's story, Andrea is right. There's some type of camaraderie that I think anyone can feel, that's gone through any type of, betrayal there. And initially, when I had first listened to the podcast, that's actually what I had searched up, was betrayal, and just to see what had come up. And the betrayal podcast had come up. And so when I listened to Jen, I felt like she understood me, so for however long it had been, maybe a year past what happened to my family, for the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing alone, on an island by myself. I was like, Jen is on this island with me. And so I sat on it for a minute, because someone in my position as a wife of somebody who's done something so terrible, and as a mother, to my children, I felt really powerless in whatever it was, whether it was with the judicial system or within my community, or emotionally for my children or for my extended family. And I just knew that I needed to say something. I needed other people to know, and I wanted to be a part of that. And so I just emailed in. It was like maybe not even a paragraph. It was more bullet points, as I told him what my name was. And I said, here's my story. My husband was this, 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 and this, and he's also this. But I thought in my head, I was like, okay, well, now I've done what my conscience is telling me to do. So that's really the reason why I went on this journey. And I'm so grateful that they listened and they heard me, because
Absolutely.
I wasn't being heard.
Yeah. For those that have not yet had the chance to hear the second season, do you want to share a little bit about your story and again what led you to reach out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So my my husband and I lived just a typical suburban life. He was well known in our community. He'd raised my older two children from the time they were my oldest was 2 and my son was 5 months old. So he has always been their father. And we do have a child together. Um, I mean, just typical life, soccer mom, dance mom, football mom. It was just very, very typical. And while starting a business, I just happened to come across a folder of child sexual abuse material in his iCloud account. And season 2 really kind of goes over, that story, but uses it more. It's more of like a lift off for some bigger topics that need to be, talked about, as far as, legislation or sentencing guidelines, or just like you said, from, a victim or a survivor's perspective, and how the world treats us versus how a lot of our programming and things like that are geared towards our perpetrator, and where we're left kind of in the dust to try to figure out what to do next. And it's very isolating, very, very isolating. And so our season 2 goes into that. And then it also goes into like the mental health side of things as well. And maybe why I was able to stay in relationships, not just with my husband, but maybe earlier on, and make the decisions that I had made. And I think that's really where a lot of our listeners were able to connect with that as well. So it was fun to kind of see the podcast take on a mind of its own and explore some of these really important topics that a lot of the listeners, I know, because I've read some of the emails, which I'm so grateful for, but they've really connected to.
Yeah. You mentioned those, and thank you for sharing your story there. And you mentioned the emails, Andrea. You received countless emails after the first season of Betrayal, and really trying to decide, how do you process these? What do you do with this? But there was something that really connected you with Ashley's story. And I'm curious, what was it that allowed you to sort of connect so deeply to Ashley when you saw her outreach?
I think that she was just radically transparent and
Mm-hmm.
honest and open. And, we're never in the business of convincing anyone to like share their story. And it just
Yeah.
seemed like Ashley was just so ready.
Yeah.
And listen, like, and Ashley knows this, when we considered a lot of stories that people had shared with us. And in this particular case, we struggled with it because it was, I mean, the crime itself is about child sexual abuse material. And
Yeah.
I give a lot of credit to you. I give a lot of credit to Allie Perry, who is our direct report with you guys.
Mm-hmm.
That you guys, we've reached out and said, hey guys, this is what this topic is. How do you guys feel about it? Because the reality is this is the topic that people are really afraid of.
Yeah.
And people are really, it's like, oh, I don't know if I want to hear about this. This is too much. And instead of backing off of it, we all leaned in, and you and iHeart were so game for it. And I just thought that was so, so cool. I think in terms of Ashley, she wrote to us saying, I too am a part of a club no one wants to be a part of.
Yeah.
And, she felt so isolated. And I think that she just was ready to like command her voice. And it just resonated on paper.
Yeah. Well, it's, this story obviously has now been heard, your story, Ashley, by millions of people. And I'm curious what that experience has been like, because I'm sure that, it took a lot of bravery to reach out and say, I feel like I should tell this story. I feel like I'm ready to tell the story. I'm sure it was also in some respects, I'm assuming, terrifying to do that at some level as well. But what has the experience been like sharing your story with the world? Or are you glad that you made the decision to? It sounds like you are, but just curious what that experience has been like.
Yeah, it's interesting because even when I go back to when I reported my husband, it was there wasn't even a choice. Like that's just what needed to be done, and there wasn't a choice. And that's exactly how I feel about the podcast. Like I understand that there's always a choice or whatever, but I just felt like this is what had to be done, and I still feel that way. Um, and so for me, I knew when I opened this that it was going to be something that I did for the rest of my life. And not necessarily just because I wanted to share my story and, uh, all that. I knew that my story was more of like a lift off of more things and bigger things and, things that people read about every day in the news, but nobody really wants to talk about. Um, so it's been really, really relieving to see that I've opened some lines of communication for even just those around me. Um, but it's also interesting too, because people hear the story through their headphones or whatever. And then they do feel this connection, with my story, but it's still uncomfortable for some people to ask me about it. And the way that I see it is when this happened to my family, it was in the media. So our whole local community knew. And I feel like a lot of any type of pride or ego that I had was brushed away. So sharing, essentially sharing the worst parts of anybody's life, and especially with it being so traumatic, and not just for me, but for my children, for my family, and even for my husband. Um, I knew that there were going to be some people that would rather just sweep it under the rug and just move on with life and not talk
Yeah.
about it. But that's the reason why this type of behavior keeps happening,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
nobody wants to talk about it.
Yeah. That's why we can pretend that these are super fringe, but stories, but in reality, at varying levels, this
Right.
is all too common of a story, right? Again, it's sort of these different kinds of levels. And Andrea, before I let you two go, I would love to just hear from you, I guess to back up a little bit, these stories are, of course, shocking and upsetting when you hear them, but also interestingly inspiring when you listen to them as well, like the strength of the subject matter here and the strength of the women, of the survivors, and where we go from here. I'm curious, what is your hope for listeners in listening to Betrayal? What would you hope listeners would get out of each season?
I think the biggest thing is for people that come to this podcast like Ashley, that they don't feel alone. And, that was the thing that Jen and I talked about all the time when we first started making season 1 was if this just helps one person feel less alone, then we did our job. And so, I've watched 2 women really grow and wrestle with really complicated emotional baggage and have done a Herculean like like evolution within, you know, what Ashley's been able to overcome and really examine personally. When I first met Jen, she was really angry and has gotten to a place of peace. Like there is peace on the other side of this. And so I think people come to the show for different reasons. And I think they'll find their own individual thing that makes them realize why they're listening. But I think really it's to help people feel less alone and show you that time does move on and you are capable of growth and you are stronger than you think and you are resilient. And, you know, to Ashley's point, like she didn't even want anything out in the papers. And now she's putting it out in front of 1 million people.
Right.
You know, it's just having the ability to reclaim what happened to you and, you know, stand in your power is a really powerful thing.
Yeah. And you probably won't ever know just how many people you've had a positive impact on from hearing your story and that connection that they feel to you. I'm sure many of them will reach out, and many more, probably many more than that, will never reach out, but they'll still feel that connection. So
yeah,
we're honored that we've had the opportunity to work with both of you on this. And I know that, like we said, after the first season, we hear from so many listeners, and I think we'll continue to work with the team to tell these stories. But really appreciate your spending some time with us today. And I hope that everybody watching and listening, if you've not yet heard it, Betrayal, it's just like we said before, it's a difficult podcast at times to listen to. And these are really difficult stories, but also inspiring and really important. And I hope everybody will check them out. But Andrea, Ashley, thanks for spending some time with us.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah, thank you, Will. I appreciate you and the whole iHeart team. So thank you.
Yeah, you guys are amazing. Thank you.
And thanks everybody for spending some time with us today. We'll see you again next week.
Podversations is a production of iHeartRadio. You can find more from the biggest names in podcasting on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.